the exodus of roughly 250,000 Jews from the Soviet Union between, say, 1969 and 1979 is probably the single greatest human rights success of the post-war period. Certainly the greatest human rights success in modern Jewish history to have gotten that many people out. The relationship between the Jewish national movement or the Jewish movement for emigration on the one hand and the dissident movement has a number of layers. Michael, as you mentioned, people of Jewish background with one or both Jewish parents were dramatically overrepresented in the movement. And by that, I mean among those roughly 1,000 core activists, the people who regularly put their names to petitions and open letters on behalf of the rule of law. And the right to emigrate was one of the rights that the so-called rights defenders, the pravozащитники, were advocating for. And there were many instances in which Sakharov and other dissidents, Jews and non-Jews, supported the cause of emigration of Soviet Jews from the Soviet Union. And this is where things get interesting. When the rights defenders, defended that right, they did so using the vocabulary of universal human rights. Sure. And the argument was everyone has the right not only to leave their country of birth, but to return to it. When the refuseniks articulated their case, they generally did not use the right of the human right of emigration, but rather the Soviet right of repatriation. I have a separate article about this that I couldn't get into the book. The Soviet argument was about the right of specific national groups that had been displaced from their historic homelands, including homelands inside the multinational Soviet Union, to return to those areas. And the repatriation argument overlaps with, but is not the same as the universal argument. So the so-called refuseniks, the people who had applied for visas to leave the Soviet Union, in most cases to go to Israel, wherever they happened to end up at the end of the game, the refuseniks, they wanted the cooperation of the rights defenders, but they themselves did not want to get mixed up or entangled in any way with Soviet domestic politics, because they thought that doing so would decrease their chances of being given permission to leave. They simply wanted to exit the country. And many of them cautioned their fellow refuseniks about getting too close to the dissidents with a capital D, the rights defenders, lest the Jewish emigration movement be caught up in the punishments that were being meted out to Soviet dissidents. So there was some interesting tensions between the movement, even as there was a fair amount of interplay and a mutual adoption of techniques. The last thing I'll say is that if you look at the people who were dissidents and the people who were refuseniks, and if you look at the bridge builders between the two, and the most important was Natan Sharansky, but there were others, and look at the migration, who was crossing that bridge from one to the other, the traffic is exclusively in one direction. There were people who began in the dissident movement and who by the late 60s or early 70s essentially gave up on the movement ever being able to achieve its goals of turning the Soviet Union into a rule of law country, and they migrated towards the Jewish national movement. I don't know of a single case of someone who began within the Jewish emigration movement and migrated or evolved to become a dissident, capital D.